course, we have Thanksgiving and Christmas, but today we're starting in James, and it'll probably take us through January with all the special speakers and different things going on, and that's okay. We're going to keep plowing our way through, and we'll get there maybe about the end of January. But today we're going to start the book of James, and I'm already enjoying my study in James and learning a lot, and thank you, Dave Hoffman, for reading this morning and answering the call of Jesus. That was good. James 1:1. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, greetings. This is how he begins his letter. And James, the James referred to here, is actually the brother of Jesus. And there's some very interesting things about James, who is the brother of Christ. Originally, he was not a believer, and we'll mention this here in a bit. But apparently, he became a believer at the resurrection of Christ, is what the general thinking is. And he's noted in several places in the New Testament as being a leader of the church. First, the church in Jerusalem, and then later the wider church. And there are a couple of references I wanted to make mention of this morning. First is John 7:5. For even his own brothers did not believe him. This is speaking of Christ, stating that his own brothers were not followers of Christ. And then 1 Corinthians 15:7. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. This is later on when Jesus appeared. He apparently appeared to his brother even before he appeared to the apostles. And we know that his brother became a believer because of these events. And then in Acts 1:13 through 14, another reference. And this is really fascinating to me. Scholars believe that James was at this prayer meeting in the upper room. And this falls between the Ascension and the day of Pentecost, and it shows that James had become a leader in the church in just that short time, and so he is here. When they arrived, they went upstairs to the room where they were staying. That is most likely the same room where Judas betrayed Christ and where the Last Supper was held, and this is where the disciples were meeting. Those present were Peter, John, James, and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas, son of James. They all joined together constantly in prayer, along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. There were great changes that happened after the resurrection of Christ, and it happened very rapidly. And part of that is James becoming a Christian. And it's generally accepted that James was here and present at this special prayer meeting. And so James became a leader in the New Testament church and must have undergone a conversion experience, much like Paul, where he went from disbelieving to believing and even becoming a leader in the New Testament church. It also is shown in Galatians 1:19. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. This is Paul in his letter mentioning his connection with James. And then in Galatians 2:9, James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars, that means pillars in the church, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. So this really shows the place that James had in the New Testament church. Now, he writes this a letter right there in verse 1, which we just read, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, and he gives his greetings. Well, who are these 12 tribes that were dispersed, and where were they dispersed to? We don't know a lot about the specifics of where these Christians ended up, but they were Jewish Christians who had previously been in Jerusalem, and James was considered the leader of the Jerusalem church. And when these Christians were scattered, they escaped to various locations throughout Judea, Samaria, and as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Syrian Antioch. It's a long way from Jerusalem. But they had scattered, and so James is writing his letter to these Christians. And obviously, they couldn't all read this letter all at once, so this would have been a letter that would make the circuit, and one group of believers would pass it on to another group of believers and make copies of it and share it around with the believers who had escaped to various locations. And interestingly, James is one of the first New Testament letters written, probably written even before the conversion of Paul, about 1 to 3 years before Paul had become converted. And James is sort of an unusual book, and I think part of that is due to the fact that it was written so early on. It doesn't read like a lot of the other New Testament books, letters, and often it's misunderstood. Speaking of being misunderstood, there was a woman who had been out shopping. She's going shopping for the day, and she was backing out of her parking spot, but she couldn't see behind her, and she said to her young son in the back seat, "Look and see if there are any cars coming." And so the boy looks and says, "No," and she continues to back up, and then a truck slams into the back of their car. Apparently, you need to specify if it's a car or a truck. James is misunderstood, and even Martin Luther questioned the place of James in the canon. And there are some thinking that, James speaks of faith plus works and what that means. And some had thought that maybe that was contrary to Paul's mention of by grace through faith, salvation by grace through faith. And even Martin Luther struggled to understand the place of James in the Scriptures. And James doesn't read like many of the other books. It actually kind of reads like Proverbs. Sometimes he comes across like short quips of wisdom woven throughout the book. But in many ways, as we'll see throughout the coming weeks, James is unlike Proverbs. Although it does speak of wisdom and other things like prudence and principles that Proverbs speak of, you will see in the coming weeks how James is kind of unlike Proverbs. So what is the place of James in the Scriptures? What does James bring to us as believers? As we will see, James is to the New Testament believer what the law was to the Old Testament saint. That is, that James brings up some ways that we can follow the Lord, and he gives a number of tests of the Christian faith. Over the weeks, that's how I divided up my series of messages, is by these tests, and today we'll look at 2 of them. I wanted to start today, though, with what I think is probably the key passage in James. It's actually, the key verse of James is actually James 1:22, and we'll read this section just now. "But prove yourselves doers of the word, and not merely hearers who delude themselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, he has immediately forgotten what kind of person he was. But one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man shall be blessed in what he does. If anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. This is pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world." A couple of things I'd like to say about this section. This is the key verse, verse 22, for the book of James. Prove yourself doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. We'll be spending quite a bit of time in the coming weeks sort of talking about what does this mean to be not just hearers of the word, but also to be doers of the word. And what is the relationship between works and faith? And James is not to be confused, but can be understood in very plain, with a very plain understanding. And I think we will see this as we progress through the coming weeks. One of the things I want to point out here is when it's speaking about a person who looks intently into the mirror. In the Greek, this word looks intently at the perfect law is the same kind of language when John went to the empty tomb and looked in. It says that he looked intently for Christ. And so it shows you that the idea of looking intently and then going away. And we'll be talking about that a little bit this morning. James 2:14, kind of along the same lines with this discussion about faith and works. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? That's the overriding question in the book of James. Can we be saved if we claim to be saved but have no works? What does that mean? And this is a question that will be answered throughout the book of James. And it will take us probably through January to accomplish this, but we will get there. And we'll enjoy our study as we progress along. Galatians 2:20 through 21. It's always important, and I think maybe even more so with a book like James. But it's always important when we read a particular New Testament book, or any book in Scriptures, to read it alongside of other books. It's really important with James. And so I picked one passage out of Galatians 2:20 through 21. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. So I think it's helpful to read James alongside of other New Testament letters like Galatians. It helps us to understand that James is not speaking against Paul and grace by faith. He's very complimentary to these things, as we'll see. But he says, Paul says here, the life you now live by faith. But the book of James brings up some great questions. Is it true that every person has faith in something? Is it that some people have faith and other people don't have faith? Or is it true that every person has faith in something? We're going to answer this question. Are there people who just have no faith at all? And does James agree with that idea? So is faith something you either have it or you don't? Or is faith something that everyone has, but their faith is aimed at one thing or another? And then, of course, in line with James, is there a kind of faith that doesn't bear out in works? Are there some Christians who just never mature to the point of doing Christian works and being spiritually productive? Well, one way to look at the letter of James is to see these tests throughout the book. They're sort of tests of faith, tests to see if you're a person of faith. And James highlights these various tests, and we'll be breaking down our study of the book of James by these tests, and today we're going to look at two. The first one is the test of perseverance in suffering. Shows up in chapter 1, verses 2 through 12. We won't read it again, but maybe you will keep your scriptures open to those verses and you can refer to them as we discuss our way through this. What does James teach us about trials? Remember that he's speaking to believers that have just been run out of their hometown to various places around the Middle East. These are people who knew what suffering was. They would have had to have left their employment. They would have probably left family. They would have left their home. And now they're living in faraway, unfamiliar places and suffering because they were followers of Christ. Probably this all happened right on the heels of the stoning of Stephen and the events that happened around that time. So the test here is perseverance in suffering. And James teaches us a lot about what it means to persevere through times of trial. There's a question that kind of turns over in my own mind as I think about trials. Are trials only the sufferings that happen for the cause of Christ? Or is James talking about mundane trials that we might go through? In other words, are the trials here only, do they only count as trials as far as James is concerned? If it's like the trial a missionary goes through, or if we're suffering because we're trying to win a family member to Christ and they're not having it. Are those kind of trials only qualified by what James is saying here? Or are all trials that he's speaking of? Is it unspiritual to take this passage about trials and apply it to my own mundane, everyday troubles? Well, I think there's a verse that speaks to this. It's John 15, 20, and 21. Remember what I told you. A servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me. I think what is taught here in the Gospel of John is the idea that just because we name the name of Christ, we will face trials, that we will face troubles, unlike a person who doesn't know Christ. And if you think about it, it really makes sense that just by naming the name of Christ, just by becoming a believer, we will face trials because we now have a target on our back. The enemy sees us now as a target because we have aligned ourselves with Christ. So I don't think it's unspiritual to think of our mundane trials as what James is talking about here. I don't think it's an unbiblical idea to apply our everyday trials to what James is talking about here. All of us will suffer in some way when we align ourselves with Christ. Well, there are things that we can learn about trials through this section. First, trials are a reason for rejoicing. It's right there in verse 2. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. It's kind of a shocking verse to read, to think about trials and joy together. But that's what James is telling these believers that they should do. Count it joy that you've been scattered about and that you're suffering because of following Christ. This is really a tough one, but I think it gets at the heart of our own struggles when we're having a trial. If we can think of going into a trial with joy. There's this lack of favor of Christianity today, and I was thinking the other day, what if the midterm elections coming up don't go our way? What if we find ourselves suffering more on the backside of that election? Will we count it joy to suffer? Or will we hold that begrudgingly and gripe and complain about it? All of our trials, according to James, should be approached with joy. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. Trials are a reason for rejoicing. Number 2, the reason trials bring joy is that they bring perseverance. This is in verse 3. James 1:3, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. This is the old, don't ever pray for patience because God is going to teach it to you. Don't pray for perseverance either, because it probably will come with testing to produce it. And that's what it says here in verse 3. I was thinking about different trials we'll go through. And if we go into a trial and God has a purpose for us going through that trial, and if we come out on the backside of that trial, but we didn't attain the things that He wanted us to attain, we didn't learn the things He wanted us to learn, then we'll probably have to go through more trials to learn that thing again. I wrote this quote down. Every once in a while I get to quote myself. Battles that are fought and lost are most often fought again. Battles that are fought and lost are often fought again. If we don't learn what God wants us to learn as we go through a trial, we will probably find ourselves in a trial similar down the road. This is why it's so important to take our battles to the Lord, to see what He wants to develop in us when we're going through a difficult time, to find a joyful meaning in the trial, not just trudge our way through the trial, but to figure out what it is that God wants us to learn. Think about the spiritual battles that you faced in your own life. Think about the hurdles that you've had to come over to get to the place where you are in your spiritual walk. Think about some of the troubles you've gone through in your own life. Do you ever think to yourself that a battle you're fighting has been fought before? Like you're going through a difficult time and you think, this is so much like another time in my life when I had come through a difficult time. I think sometimes there are themes to the trials that we go through, and that God is trying to accomplish maturity and growth in us as we make our way through various trials. The next one, trials can make us mature and complete. Verse 4, let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So apparently in this verse we learn that there's a qualification, that it's not an automatic maturity just because we've gone through a trial, but there's a qualification. We have to proceed through the trial in a certain fashion in order to come out on the other side with more maturity. We must let the trial have its perfect result. Verse 4 uses that word, that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. There's a way to go through a trial, though, that doesn't produce endurance and result in rewards and maturity. We have ways of short-circuiting the effects of trials, don't we? We go through a trial, we have all these little ways that we can proceed through the trial and not really learn what we're supposed to learn. Maybe we put our head in the sand and pretend that it isn't happening. Maybe we're dismissive of the trial. We say, well, there's nothing I can do about it, so let's just ignore it and move on. I guess we'll just forget about it. Sometimes we do that as we're working our way through a trial. We might see the battle also as only physical and not spiritual. We might have a conflict with someone and think only in terms of that physical conflict. And we need to be reminded of Ephesians 6:12. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. I think this gives us motivation. The moment we find ourselves going through a trial, the second we think that we are being tested, to begin praying and asking what the Lord would have for us, how He would want us to proceed, and not just act out of our first thoughts or like a knee-jerk reaction, but proceed with prayer and ask the Lord how He would have us move forward in any trial. And this doesn't mean that we see a demon behind every bush. Some folks go about thinking everything's the devil. The devil's behind everything. Sometimes it's our own flesh that brings on a trial. Sometimes it's just the world we live in. But we do know that the enemy seeks to bring us down and is always looking to target us because our relationship with Christ. Well, verse 7 says that trials will result in rewards. James 1:7, that person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. It's talking about rewards that will come for the person that proceeds through trial and is faithful, taking it to the Lord as they undergo a various trial. So what are those qualifications? What are the things that we need to do in order to be faithful to the Lord as we go through the trial? Well, they're listed here in James 1. First of all, we need to act in faith. It's in verse 1:6, James 1:6. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt. It's talking about having faith. Because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. We need to have faith and not doubt as we proceed through our trials. And then verse 12, James 1:12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. Now, this isn't the person who just puts their head in the sand and, just tries to bide their time to get through it. This is the person who is persevering. Because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. James 1:12. So, the rewards are for those who act in faith. Secondly, for those who are not double-minded, verses 7 through 8. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. That's the double-minded person. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. So as we move through our trials, we need to have faith and trust in the Lord and not be double-minded. This word, that person, your Bible might say that man. It's actually a bit of a derogatory term. Sort of like you could read this with sort of a sneer. That man. That person is double-minded. They're a doubter. We need to not doubt, but be faith-filled as we work our way through various trials. And then, of course, verses 9 through 10, not based on one's personal wealth. This is one of those cases where in the book of James, you're reading along and you go, oh, he switched topics. Well, he's not really switching topics. He's just furthering the idea that he was talking about in the previous verses. Here he says, believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wild flower. I imagine that among the people who escaped out of Jerusalem under this persecution, probably some of them would have been rich people who had the resources to go away and sort of take an extended vacation and just go live somewhere else for a while. And I suppose there were others who were of humble circumstances and had to go to other places and find work to support themselves. And James is addressing both categories. He's saying if you're in a humble circumstance, take pride in your high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. He's saying don't have trust in wealth. I was thinking about that in the last week. When we go through trials, it really matters little whether we are wealthy or whether we're poor. All people go through trials. I was thinking about Steve Jobs. Remember those photos that we saw on the internet of Steve Jobs in his last days when he had to have somebody hold him up and he looked so frail and weak? I looked it up. At the time of his death, he was worth $10 billion. But still, his money could not help him to keep the cancer at bay. And that's the way it is with the wealthy. Everyone dies, and all the money in the world cannot prevent us from having trials. I might make it a little easier People who are wealthy probably don't have the same financial troubles that the poor have. But for most trials, money is not going to keep you from having those trials. Everyone dies, everyone suffers, and everyone has times of trial. There's a sense in which, being wealthy may even make being in a trial, take an illness, for example. It may make being wealthy make the trial even seem more cruel. That you have all these resources, but these resources can't help you fix the situation. This is especially true when we're talking about people problems. We cannot fix people with money, can we? And sometimes those trials end up on our own doorstep. Well, test number 2. James gives us the perspective on temptation. This is in verses 13 through 18. So he moves from trials to temptation. Goes from the encouragement on perseverance, he moves into this short discussion on temptation. And mainly the idea that God is not the tempter. Let no one say, when he is being tempted, that God is the one who is tempting him. And again, it seems like he's switched gears, gone into a whole new topic here. But really, he's following through with the idea of trials. Why does this discourse on temptation follow on the trials? There's really a close connection between these two subjects, trials and temptation. One of the reasons that they go together thematically is that temptation is just one more kind of trial. And when we go through a period of temptation, whatever that temptation might be, it really is just another kind of trial. And perhaps temptation can be one of the most difficult kinds of trial, because sometimes it's more in our head and ethereal and not a physical trial like an illness. It's interesting. So there's a Greek, I don't often talk about Greek words, but I happened to look this one up because I wanted to make sure what I was reading was true, and it is true. The Greek word peirasmos is for trial, and it shows up in verse 2, and then it shows up again in verse 13. So really, it's the same word for trial and temptation. In verse 2, it's a noun, and in verse 13, it's a verb. It's the same word. I actually looked it up in the Greek, and sure enough, it's the same word with two different forms. So really, James is treating trials and temptations as the same thing. That they're both doing the same thing in our lives. And if you think about it, it probably matters little to our enemy whether he chooses to use a trial or whether he chooses to use a temptation. Either way, his goal is to drag us down and to keep us from the Lord and our trust in the Lord. Both are meant to discourage and unnerve us and distract us from our Christian purposes. Well, in 13, he mentions a lust. I did give that one. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Again, it seems like he's kind of turned the corner and gone into a new subject here. But there's a reason why he's talking about the fact that God cannot be tempted. There's a tie-in here. I want to talk about that for just a bit. We'll get there in a second. I want to mention one other thing first, and that's a couple weeks ago in the men's Bible study, we were talking about sin and desire. And I suggested that it might be helpful to ask at times, what is it in my heart? Like, what is the longing in my heart? Whether it's evil or whether it's pure. What is the thing my heart's looking for when I have an evil desire? When I desire something that I know the Lord does not want me to have. I think there's value sometimes in asking ourselves, why is it, or what is it within me that makes me desire something or makes some sin look attractive? think it's helpful to understand ourselves and where these thoughts and temptations come from. And what I wanted to get to here is this, that within these verses, 13 and following, there's this idea of the character of God. He's talking about the character of God, and there's sort of a comparison to our own evil desires and lusts. He's saying that God is not like us, that we are altogether different than God. In some ways, yes, we are made in His image, but in character, God is not like us. It shows up in other places in Scripture. In 1 Samuel 2:2, there is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one like you besides you. There is no rock like our God. And then compare that with Romans 3:23, a verse that maybe you've memorized at one time in your life. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Compare how sin-oriented we can be sometimes and how utterly holy God is. And I think James is drawing out this contrast here. He's saying God is not like us. He can be trusted. He can be the one we turn to when we face trials and troubles, temptations. And then James goes into this, we'll kind of wrap up with this in verses 16 and 17. He says, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good thing bestowed and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow." Again, he's mentioning God's character. God doesn't change. We change. You know, see a new commercial on television for a new brand of car. Ooh, I got to have that car. You know, we change all the time. God does not change. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so when we go through trials, who is the person that we can trust in? It's not ourselves. It's not so much our friends, although it's good to ask for prayer and support from friends. But ultimately, God is the one who does not change and who can be trusted. His character is solid. So sometimes when we read James, we're going to see how there's maybe a disconnection between one verse and the next. It sort of reads like Proverbs, but James is really connecting these ideas together, as we'll see. Well, let's wrap it up today. As we look at our life, where do we see the places where there are trials or the potential for evil desires? Where are those temptations or trials that trip us up? Where are we facing troubles that we need to take to the Lord? I think the book of James will help us with these things. And think about, where have we fought battles in the past? What are the areas in my life where I fought battles in the past? And how do I remain solid as I proceed with the Lord in the future? Well, I'm really looking forward to our study in James. We're going to be learning a lot. And maybe it's a short book. I'm trying to read James every day, and that's been helping me. Maybe you would like to do the same thing. But we're going to learn much as we proceed in the coming weeks. And don't forget, next week, Bobby Gupta will be here. It'll be a great challenge. Bring your friends. I think it'll be an exciting Sunday next week.